Good afternoon, and welcome to the MRF's Ask the Expert series presented by OncoSec. My name is Cassie Beisel, and I am the Senior Advocacy Officer with the Melanoma Research Foundation. My role includes empowering and mobilizing advocates from across the country to ensure that melanoma is a national priority. In this afternoon's Ask the Expert session, we will be discussing myths and facts surrounding clinical trials and challenges with melanoma treatment surrounding COVID-19. I am happy to introduce our speakers today, Dr. Stephanie Goff, who's the Associate Research Physician at the NIH NCI, and Jamie Goldfarb, a melanoma survivor and clinical trial advocate. Hi guys, thanks for being with us. Let's get started by discussing clinical trials, myths, and facts. I'll start with Jamie. Jamie, do you have any preconceived notions about clinical trials?
Well, when I was diagnosed with melanoma, I was in a different life situation because I worked in clinical trial patient recruitment. So I was able to quickly understand that my choice was not whether to join a clinical trial, it was which clinical trial to join. That being said, with the patients that I work with and people who are not so intimately involved in clinical trials, there is a huge range of misunderstanding, misconception, mistrust about what clinical trials are, when they should be considered, and what they're for. The biggest myth being that they are a last-ditch effort, when of course we know that they are not a last-ditch effort. They should be discussed as viable treatment options right from the beginning, when you're first making your treatment decisions. So if I would say there's any myth that I think is the most damaging to clinical trial participation, it's that one.
Okay, great. And so let's talk about TIL for a minute. How did you find out about TIL and what were the resources you used?
So when I was diagnosed, my medical oncologist, being a wonderful human being and physician, said the best thing he could do for me is to send me to someone else, for specialized care. And he suggested the NCI, National Cancer Institute, which was where I received TIL. So in the very beginning stages, right after diagnosis, I met with doctors at NCI, and I also met with other key opinion leaders in melanoma across the country, University of Pennsylvania, with Dr. Lynn Schuchter and Keith Flaherty at Mass General and Sloan Kettering, to hear about all the different research that was happening and to decide which trial I should do. And everyone decided together with me that if I were eligible for TIL, that would be my best first option.
Do you want me to talk a little bit about what TIL is for people that may not know?
That would be great. Thank you so much, Dr. Goff.
Sure. So TIL is TIL, and that is an acronym for tumor infiltrating lymphocytes. And that's really honestly because we just lack imagination. They are lymphocytes that have infiltrated their way into a tumor. So we try to take advantage of the fact that there's an opportunity that the immune system may have seen a patient's cancer, in this case, Jamie's, and where better to find the immune cells that have been able to fight that tumor than the ones that have figured out how to get inside of it. And so we've shorthand called that TIL therapy, and that's where we take those cells from a resection, grow them in the lab, do some things to them, and then give them back to the patient. That's the trial that Jamie's referring to.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for that. And just back to you, Jamie, real quick. How did you determine that TIL was the right trial for you to move forward with?
So when I was diagnosed, it was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, yay. And it's exciting. And a lot of things were in development at the time for melanoma. It was a really exciting research landscape, but there was only IL-2 approved. So I had only one approved treatment option, and all the rest was in clinical trials. And so when I was making a treatment decision, it was all about, for me, so all the trials for melanoma are immunotherapy. And so they carry some consideration of long-term side effects. And so for me, the biggest decision was to do things in the right order so that I wasn't going to potentially have a long-term side effect that would then make me ineligible for to try another treatment. So I based my treatment decision on that. I wanted to make sure I was doing things in the right order if I needed to. And then also my confidence in the institution. And also I wanted to do the heaviest hitting one first, because when I was diagnosed, I had no symptoms of the cancer. So I figured that theoretically that would be the best I would feel in my life before with the cancer would be right then. And I wanted to do, quote unquote, I didn't want to take the easy road. I didn't care what the side effects were or what was going to happen during the treatment. I wanted the best chance of survival because, by the way, I also had an 11-month-old baby and was diagnosed the day before I was supposed to return to work from maternity leave. And at the time, and it's not much different now, 5-year survival rate for melanoma was 15%. So that wasn't a good odd with a baby. So I chose my trial based on the potential for long-term survival.
Great. And, as someone who has, been through the long journey of, melanoma and getting treatment, can you discuss the importance of being your own advocate? Because you really seem like you had to really advocate for yourself and were successful with that.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, as a lot of us know, only about 5% of people with cancer ever participate in clinical research. The single greatest reason for that is because physicians don't refer to clinical trials very often. So it's very important to be your own advocate because you're not always being presented with all of the options. It's not the fault of anyone. It's not that's not to point fingers at how medicine is practiced. It's just a fact. And when I was going through treatment and how I became an advocate in the first place was because I was blogging about what it was like to go through a clinical trial as I was going through my trial at NCI, and patients started contacting me because they had been told they also had melanoma. They had been told by their physicians that there was nothing for them, that they needed to get their affairs in order, and they had, weeks to months left, with no discussion at all about the fact that clinical trials exist or where you could go to find out about clinical trials. So these patients were desperately researching options on their own online, stumbling upon my blog and contacting me. And then I was realizing what a huge hole there is in patient information, direct to patient information about clinical trials. We've historically used doctors as gatekeepers, especially around oncology clinical trials. Seemingly out of respect for the patients, but we're at the point now where we really need to get clinical trial information directly into the hands of patients, or they're not going to have all of the information they need to make treatment decisions.
That is great advice. Thank you for that. And lastly, when you're talking about, advocating for yourself, what type of research should you conduct and what type of proactive measures do you need to take control of your treatment journey?
You need to speak to sources of trusted information, like advocacy groups, like the Melanoma Research Foundation, other patients. You can find out who key opinion leaders are in melanoma by looking for one way is to look at the medical boards of the advocacy groups. Another way is to Google. And what you want to do is to find out who you need to be talking to, and then don't give up on asking questions. Never take anything at face value. I mean, and that's not intuitive advice, because when you're faced with a diagnosis of a potentially fatal illness, your first inclination is not to question the person who's presenting it to you, who's supposed to be the expert, and you want to be trusting your physician and your oncologist about what you should be doing, but it's essential that you're asking questions, asking about clinical trials proactively, researching them on your own, going to all of the different sources for cancer information, like the National Cancer Institute and advocacy groups, to see what's available for yourself and not relying on single sources of information.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Jamie. I'd like to move over to Dr. Goff now. Just to talk a little bit about the clinical trial process and an overview. Dr. Goff, what should physicians be doing to educate their patients on clinical trials?
A lot of what Jamie just said is very true, and I can tell you from my time here at the National Cancer Institute when I was a fellow, the majority of the patients that were being referred to us were being referred by their doctors. And now that I'm back on staff, I would say that has shifted, and we're seeing more patients referring themselves for our clinical trials. So patients really are taking charge of their own cancer journeys with far more confidence these days than they were even 10, 15 years ago. I think, what's important for patients and their advocates to understand is that not all clinical trials are the same. We have phases of clinical trials, and those are set up for very specific reasons. And there is a big difference between trying to get into a phase 3 trial than there is trying to get into a phase 1 trial. So just to go into those descriptions a little bit so that you understand the nuances there, when we try to test something for the very first time, it's not some crazy idea that somebody thought of yesterday. And then they just decide that they're going to try it in the next patient that comes in. Medicine's not like that. The things that we decide, even when we're doing them in people for the first time, a so-called first in human trial, it's been years, if not decades, of work that's happened in the lab, possibly in animals, to show that this hypothesis, this idea, has some merit and has some ability to work. And that when we finally get to first in human, the first thing we're trying to test is this safe? So when we're trying to test if something is safe, we're often starting at very low doses and getting higher. So there may be a situation where a patient has a cancer that's progressing pretty rapidly, and we know that we're at the very beginning of a phase 1 trial. It's not that we don't want that patient to get that drug, but we know that we're at such low doses that it would almost be the wrong thing to do to subject them to that kind of risk. So, you know, we always have a list of things you need to have to be in this trial, a list of inclusion criteria, and we have a list of things you need that make you ineligible for the trial, a list of exclusion criteria. But just because you have all of one and none of the other, it still doesn't mean it's necessarily a right fit. And a lot of that has to do with what question we're answering. So the first thing we always test is safety. And we generally have to work our way up to a dose that we think may work, whether that's a monoclonal antibody, whether that's a drug, whether that's an experimental cell therapy. The next question we try to answer in a phase 2 study is, well, we know it's safe. We've figured out how much we should give to be effective. Can we see if it is effective? And that's a phase 2 study. And this is where you'll often find that the criteria are a little bit more stringent because we want to make sure that healthy, outside of their cancer, that healthy patients are getting into these trials so that we have the ability to study this. We don't want to throw away a good idea because the patients that we tested that question in were a little bit too sick for us to understand it. And so you may see a lot of restrictions there. Once we find that something is effective, we then go into phase 3, which is where we test it against what's already involved. Now, at the time that Jamie was going through clinical trials, it was relatively straightforward to do a phase 3 in melanoma because there wasn't a whole lot that could be considered the standard. There was nothing out there with the exception of IL-2. And we rapidly, 2011, ipilimumab got approved, 2014, pembrolizumab and nivolumab got approved. The BRAF MEK inhibitors got approved in 2011, 2012. So there was this, after this huge gap, we went from 1975 with dacarbazine to 1998 with interleukin-2. And then all of a sudden at the beginning of the 2010s, we get 4 new drugs out for melanoma all right in a row. So that's made clinical trial design a little bit more tricky and has made the requirements for getting into a phase 3 trial a little bit more stringent. Now, I've given a very long-winded answer to what was a easy question, I think. So I think the core of it was understanding where in the process something is. Are you testing a very early stage question? Are you testing a middle stage question, or are you part of a big randomized trial to test whether that's efficacious? I think one of the, I hesitate to say a positive side effect of the COVID-19 crisis is that everyone in the country is more aware of what those phases are, because the same phases for a vaccine trial are the same phases that we do for our oncology trials. There might have been another question in there that I didn't answer, so please just let me know.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. I do have another follow-up question for that. Clinical trials can definitely seem scary to a patient who may not be fully educated in it, or somebody new who's trying to start a trial. Can you discuss any fears that you feel patients might have going into a clinical trial, or even discussing them with their physician?
I think this is a tricky subject, but it's one that the medical community has to own up to, which is that the careful way in which we are governing ourselves, where we are making sure that we put patients first. There are a lot of eyes on us. There are multiple regulatory agencies to make sure we do that, to protect patients. And it's because we haven't always been that great at it. Obviously, everyone knows about the Tuskegee, the horrors of the Tuskegee study, and that has just, launched generations of mistrust in the medical community. So unfortunately, we earned that distrust, and we have to fight our way back to gain that trust back again. But I have to say, anyone who's been in a clinical trial will tell you we almost over-inform you to the point of scaring you at this point, rather than not giving you enough information. And it's just so hard because clinical trials just represent one niche of overall medical care, and there are so many problems with access to quality medical care now that asking someone who can't even get into a decent internist to trust that they're going to get into a decent trial, there's a lot of mistrust built in to our medical systems right now. And so I think it's upon all of us to utilize our outreach to try to make sure patients understand we have a patient-centered focus. It doesn't matter what the question is. It doesn't matter what it may do to the trial. If it's the right thing for the patient, then we do it. And we call it a deviation, we call it a variance, we call it whatever we want, but the patient comes first. I know that's true here at the NCI. I know that it's true of all of the, NCI designated cancer centers around the country. We're searching for answers, but it's not at the expense of our patients' experience.
Thank you. And before I move to Jamie, I just have one more question for you. What are some of the barriers to clinical trials, and do you have any advice on or suggestions on how to overcome those?
For a lot of people, it's time. It's the same barriers that many people find just with their own healthcare. If you're holding down 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet, you don't have the freedom or the opportunity to take the day off to go get your study medications. We have to work on making regimens that are outpatient regimens, that are pill-based regimens, that have simple administration, that more people can be involved in. The work I do here, we don't try to select patients, but we end up treating patients who have the ability to take 3 or 4 weeks off from their life at a time. And that's not any sort of built-in means of excluding anybody. It's just the reality of sort of the seriousness of what we do. And because of that, there are certain people that just aren't going to be able to participate. We are seeing a move now. Again, another questionably, positive side effect of COVID-19, in which, we may have patients here at the NCI and Bethesda for their very first round of a treatment, but we can, because we were trying to limit travel during the pandemic, there have been times when we've been able to arrange for subsequent courses to be given under the care of an educated local oncologist who partners with us in helping to develop these clinical trial treatments. And so we may see more of a hybrid model happening. And if we can do that, if patients aren't having to travel hours to get to a centralized cancer center, if we can utilize this model where patients can go to their local home oncologist, we might be able to increase patient participation.
Thank you so much. Super helpful and insightful. Really appreciate it. Jamie, now over to you. When you were going through this clinical trial or about to go into it, did you have any preconceived fears or barriers that you may have had when beginning your trial process? And as a follow-up, what would your advice be to other patients who may be having similar hesitations around clinical trials?
Well, I did not have this hesitation, but one of the greatest hesitation and barriers that I see with other patients is that they're afraid of questioning their doctors. They're afraid that if the doctor didn't provide a clinical trial as an option, then it meant automatically that it wasn't right for them. Not that they just hadn't mentioned it, but that they had certainly considered it and just not presented it. And that if they were to ask about it, that their doctors would feel insulted and that their care would be worse for that. And that is unfortunately a more widespread way of thinking than I would like to think is true. But my advice certainly to anyone who has that fear is, if you are under the care of a physician who would be insulted and decrease your care because you said you wanted a second opinion, you need to find another physician anyway, immediately. that's not what medicine is about. I mean, I'm not a doctor, but Dr. Goff, correct me if I'm wrong. I think I would think that it is in the doctor's best interest for the patient to also be proactive about their own health and to be a real participant in their health treatment, their journey, their experience, an advocate for themselves, and not solely relying on the 10, 15 minutes, appointment that you might get each time. So yeah.
No, I was just going to say, absolutely. If you've got a doctor that's not willing to answer your questions, you need a new doctor. And all kinds of people become doctors, and all kinds of people can become very good doctors. But there needs to be an openness and a willing to communicate, there just has to be, and a willingness to maybe you've researched something new that they don't know. They need to be willing to own that. They should welcome that. They don't have time to search every clinical trial on every disease that each of their patients has. They should welcome that information, and if they don't, it's time to start looking around.
Great, thank you both. And before we move into the next topic, I just wanted, Dr. Goff, I wanted to give you the opportunity to provide any final thoughts from a physician's perspective on the clinical trial process and its importance on advancement of patients' treatment. And then maybe you can briefly talk if COVID has been a factor in delaying progress on clinical trials.
So, I often like to quote my mentor, Dr. Rosenberg here, because he is quick to say, in the history of everything that now works, there was once a day when it didn't. And so all these clinical trials are absolutely necessary to figure out what does work. When he was working on interleukin-2, it wasn't until his 66th or 67th patient that he saw tumors get smaller. And it took that kind of persistence and tenacity, and that has, been the buildup to a whole field of modern immunotherapy. So clinical trials are vitally, vitally important, and they shouldn't be the last thing you think of. It shouldn't be when your doctor says, things have gotten a little too far, we're going to give you some pain medication, we're going to keep you comfortable. That's not necessarily the right time for a clinical trial. There are some excellent clinical trials dealing with that particular stage of a patient's cancer, but it's not necessarily the best window for studying new therapies. And so, in order to make sure that we're not harming our patients, there are often a lot of inclusion criteria that require disease to be refractory to standard treatment. That's to benefit the patient, but it doesn't mean you need to be refractory to 7 or 8 or 9 lines of therapy. So say you're a patient with melanoma and you've been treated with combination ipi-nivo and that hasn't worked for you. Try a clinical trial. Don't necessarily just go to, well, I've got a BRAF mutation, I'm going to go try a BRAF MEK inhibitor now. Oh, well, now I'm going to try Nivo by itself now, or I'm going to try Pembro. It's a little bit different. Maybe it'll work differently. Think about clinical trials, because we're testing all sorts of combinations of things with checkpoint therapy that even if ipi-nivo doesn't work for you, the next thing with a checkpoint inhibitor might work. And, our science can only be as strong as our patients are. And so if our patients come to us in those last weeks of life, it doesn't make for very strong science, and we can't move forward as quickly as we should. And, I work not only in melanoma, but in a lot of other types of cancers. And it's often that I will see these patients who will get line after line after line after line of chemotherapy, none of which is known to be curative. So it's good to take a step back, look at what your options are, and do it when you're feeling healthy, when you're feeling good. Like Jamie said, she wanted to be as aggressive as she possibly could while she felt as good as she thought she was going to be. Fortunately, a combination of things worked, and now she's healthier than ever before.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And Jamie, we're so happy that you're well and here with us. So thank you. Before we segue into our next topic, I just wanted to let everyone who's watching out there know, if you have a question, please feel free to write it in the Facebook comment section, and we will try as much as possible to get to it at the end of this session. Anything we don't get to, we can certainly follow up with you afterwards. So on to the next one. The challenges that many melanoma patients and the overall melanoma community may be experiencing due to COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Goff, the COVID-19 pandemic introduced, as I just said, very incremental challenges across the country and around the globe. How have these challenges delayed the progress of melanoma research? And will this delay in research cause a potential regression in the progress that has already been made?
So this is a really tricky topic. I would say, I'm a surgical oncologist, and one of the first groups that I saw in my daily, professional email that really focused on what these delays were doing was the group of surgical oncologists, because in the early stages of a cancer, across almost every histology, the first most important step is the removal of that primary tumor, and that's often a surgical procedure. And they set up a number of guidelines about what could be delayed a little bit, what couldn't be delayed, what you should fight to have done. But then, when you're talking, I trained in New York. So when you're talking about health systems that get overwhelmed, I had the opportunity as an alumnus to see what COVID was doing to those hospitals. And there is absolutely no way that you could have gotten quality surgical care for advanced surgical procedures in the midst of all that happening. They filled their ICUs. They had to turn their ORs into ICUs. Even if they wanted to operate, they didn't have the room to operate, nor the staff to take care of patients during that really peak period in March into April. Surgical residents were deployed all over the hospital, doing anything and everything they could just to relieve the ICU, both nurses and physicians. They were putting in Foleys and checking temperatures and doing everything they could while they were suited up in there. Say they suited up to do a procedure to put in a line, they would tackle everything else that they could while they were in the room so that the nurse didn't have to blow through another set of PPE. So care had to be delayed in a certain number of circumstances, and it won't be for some time until we see how that played out. Because places like the United Kingdom have a nationalized health system, they're actually able to track this a little bit more carefully, and they've started to publish their results. And unfortunately, it does look like those delays have led to some problems with what they call a primary delay. So from the first time that you develop a symptom that could be consistent with cancer, getting that diagnosis of cancer has been lengthened by a few months. And then a secondary delay where you've been given a diagnosis of cancer and you need to get onto that treatment or have that operation, that's also been delayed a little bit as well. And so I think it's too soon. As it always is with cancer, a few months is not enough to tell us what's going to happen. But I predict that we're going to be seeing we probably will see a dip in incidence from people not getting tested, and then we'll see a little rise in incidence. So it depends on how granularly you look at that data. If you look on a month-to-month level, we probably dipped in the spring, but if you look overall in the year, we'll probably be elevated as people are getting into it now. Just anecdotally, we have a number of people here whose spouses work in various, endoscopy units and outpatient surgeries, and everything. Screening colonoscopies were delayed. Screening mammograms were delayed. There was just a lot of stuff. What I will say, though, is that it has led us to be a little bit more creative with our thinking, and I think we might actually learn a lot. So there have been some types of tumors where neoadjuvant therapy, or the application of a chemotherapy or an immunotherapy before an operation, has been an option, but has not necessarily been a popular one. That's being utilized more now. And that may show us that it may be a real world clinical trial of a difference that may be beneficial. It's still too early to tell. The FDA got creative. They looked at they looked at drug modeling data for pembrolizumab and saw that you could actually give a single dose every 6 weeks instead of every 3 weeks and still sort of have the same level. So they were able to cut the number of outpatient infusion center visits that patients on that drug needed to have. And they that all happened kind of relatively quickly in response to some of the challenges that were happening. You know, it's really difficult. Every hospital is a little different based on, you know, their case rate at the time, whether they ever had a surge or not. The way that Columbia handled this is different than the way Dana-Farber handled this, is different than the way MD Anderson handled this, very clearly different than the way that the clinical center at the NCI handled this. We went into minimal maintenance mode for about 3 months and we're gearing back up now. You know, on an individual basis, I would say that there was very certainly a pause, and we're not going to know the end results of that for a little bit of time yet.
Thank you for that. So Jamie, this one's for you. As an advocate that is in contact with many of the melanoma community, have you heard from other current melanoma patients if COVID-19 has caused any challenges for their treatment?
So I think most of the challenges that I've heard, and specific to clinical trials, not for approved therapies, I don't work in that space as much, but for clinical trials, is the travel. So for example, using myself in a not COVID environment, I would have traveled anywhere in the entire world that offered the best case for my survival. In a COVID environment, you know, patients are much more hesitant to do that, especially if they're people who have cancer and who maybe have had treatment and don't know if they're high risk, don't know, you know, if they're immunocompromised, are even more hesitant to travel than say the general population is right now. So I've seen hesitancy in that quite a bit, and also in not being able to, in having to attend your visits alone. It's very difficult as someone with cancer, especially if you're newly diagnosed, to be able to have a one-on-one conversation with a physician and retain all of that information, because your brain is going in so many different directions, you know, not the least of which is underlying all of it is, oh my gosh, am I going to die? So it can be daunting to patients to go to a large cancer center by themselves without their spouse or there's another member of their care team or friend or whomever. So those are the two, the travel and the being alone, that I've heard of most from patients.
Thank you so much for that. That's very helpful. Finally, Dr. Goff, can you provide any advice to patients who must navigate potential state travel mandates before traveling to see a physician?
That's a little tricky. Every state is different and constantly in flux. You know, being in Maryland, I just found out we've been taken off some lists, but we're still on others. And I think that the single best resource, almost everyone who's in a clinical trial has either a research protocol nurse or a patient care coordinator or someone that helps guide you through the process that's not necessarily the principal investigator. You know, I don't have patients calling me all the time about specific details about things. They're certainly welcome to, but they don't. So usually those patient care coordinators or that research nurse or maybe the ombudsman for the center or the patient, we call it the ombudsman here. Can't think of another synonym for it, but that person that's there to help you navigate the process. At each center, at each place, they're going to be the best resource, because it's not you trying to dig through 57 Google pages to figure out where you can and can't go. They've answered this question for 100 patients. So they automatically know exactly what to tell you, what your options are. I know for us, the last few months, we have asked patients who are within a reasonable driving distance to drive rather than fly. But everybody does it a little bit differently. We have had patients that as time has gone on and as the peaks have shifted, would tell us, you know, it's great that you think I'm eligible for this trial, but I'm not ready to travel yet. And now they're reaching back out to us 3-4 months later, telling us that they feel a little bit more comfortable with it. So, you know, we're in a little bit of a different situation where almost everyone that we treat is coming from elsewhere. I would say if you're, you know, traveling a couple hours to get to a regional cancer center, that cancer center is going to have the best resources for you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So now we're going to get to some questions. Before we do that, I just want to thank Dr. Goff and Jamie so much for sharing, Jamie, your incredible story, and Dr. Goff, your amazing insight and expertise surrounding clinical trials. As I mentioned, we do have a few questions from our viewers that I will review now. So first, this question is for Dr. Goff. What stage should you ask your doctor about a clinical trial?
So obviously it's not the first thing, right? The first thing is getting your head around the word cancer and absorbing that and having your family or your friends or whoever's there to help support you deal with that. And most doctors that I know won't make any great grand plans that first visit. They just let you absorb it. And then they generally follow up within a week or so to start things in motion. Clinical trials are not necessarily the right step in the very beginning of someone's cancer journey. There are very specific cancers where they are asking questions right up front. That's going to be at the bigger cancer centers, the ones that everyone has heard of, right? Memorial Sloan Kettering, Dana-Farber, MD Anderson. But there are only a few cancers in which there are really important, pertinent questions being answered there. Breast cancer, colorectal cancer are just a few that I can think off the top of my head. The time for clinical trials is usually, unfortunately, at the time at which, for most patients, disease has spread, when it's hit that metastatic stage. Because at that point is when, absent the newer immunotherapy drugs, there were never any curative options for patients at that point. There are curative options for people with local cancers, with regional cancers. It's when you get to the metastatic stages that up until recently, there weren't a lot of things that were shown to work. Now, that being said, a lot of that depends on the cancer center you go to. There are some wonderful adjuvant trials for people with local regional disease. But again, it's not the first conversation you have, and it's maybe not even the second or the third. The most important thing with early cancers is to get that planned first step done and get it done accurately. And so that's the time to ask for second opinions. That's the time to ask questions. It's not necessarily the right time to ask for clinical trials just yet.
Thank you. This one's for Dr. Goff or Jamie or both. Where can I go to learn about clinical trials that are available?
Clinicaltrials.gov. They've made it, it used to be a little unwieldy, but they've gotten the search functions a lot better now. And I think it's really navigable, but Jamie, you may have some other resources.
So clinicaltrials.gov is definitely the most comprehensive. It does have an intuitive and easy to navigate search, so you can find trials specific to your disease and your stage of disease. The information given back to you on clinicaltrials.gov is not at all written for the lay person. It's written for the medical community, and it can be very difficult for patients to understand. So it's a good source. There are some better, more patient-friendly resources. For example, the MRF resource page has places that you can look for clinical trials. The NCI has their own clinical trial listings. A lot of the pharmaceutical companies have their own searchable, patient-friendly searchable protocol summaries on their websites. Also, CISCRP is a great resource. CenterWatch has a wonderful clinical trials finding tool. We said that all the advocacy groups will have them for your specific disease, in this case, melanoma, so MRF, or some of the others. They have their own patient resources, patient trial guides, trial matching services. A lot of advocacy groups even have nurses on staff who will speak with you as a patient and will help find clinical trials for you using some more medical professional directed resources like clinicaltrials.gov and other things. So there is there's another one called Find Me Cure, which is very much like clinicaltrials.gov, but it's all it's written under health literacy tenants. So all the information is patient friendly that's returned about the trials. So there are different resources. I would say the most comprehensive and the easiest list would be clinicaltrials.gov. And that would, although patients might need some help in understanding the information, and then the advocacy listings and trial matching services like at MRF, and then the National Cancer Institute's own listing on the webpage about what trials are available.
Thank you so much, Jamie and Dr. Goff. That's a lot more advanced than when I had melanoma in 2011. I believe there was just clinicaltrials.gov. Jamie did mention a resource at the Melanoma Research Foundation. I just want to let everyone know that they can find that resource at melanoma.org. Let's see, we have another question here. Dr. Goff, let's see, what are some of the costs associated with taking part in a clinical trial?
Again, that's highly variable. There should be minimal cost to most patients who are in one. I can only speak specifically to what we do here at the NCI. Even more specifically, I can only talk about what we do here in my branch. And that is, we do request that patients make that first trip here on their own. But once we decide that someone is eligible, we take care of everything from there on out, their travel, their scans, their blood work, anything that can be done at the clinical center in Bethesda, we do free of charge. No one will even ask you for an insurance card. So I know that that is a special situation. It's part of why I enjoy my work here, because we have the freedom to do that. Many of the bigger cancer centers have gotten really savvy at making sure that blood draws are clinically indicated, a number of other things, so that they can be billed and not billed back to the patient. And that is usually built into the clinical trial funding sources. But it's always an important question to ask, because people know, designers of trials now know, that in order to get the best cross-section of people involved in your trial, you have to make it easy. There can't be a barrier to entry there. It shouldn't be pay to play. And so there's a big push to diminish cost as much as possible. Yeah, so it's very hard to speak for anything other than the ones that I know so intimately.
Thank you. And we just have a couple more, and I'm just going to roll this one right into you again, Dr. Goff. So you've got your work cut out for you today. So somebody states that they are currently enrolled in a clinical trial and decided that it's not the right thing for them. Can they end their participation?
Absolutely. It is a patient-centered process. If you are not happy what's happening, if you are developing maybe a so there are lots of different reasons, right? If you have a side effect that's causing you not to want to take a drug anymore, that's something they need to know, and you'll be marked down as such. If you have just decided that you don't want to travel anymore, that you don't like the way the medication tastes, or you don't like the infusion center that they've asked you to go to, you can leave the clinical trial. Nothing is mandatory. Signing that consent form does not give them the right to your life from that point on. It is completely voluntary, and you can leave at any time. And if they tell you you can't, contact their IRB, their Institutional Research Board, because they absolutely have to let you leave a trial if you want to.
Thank you so much for that. There's a question for me, surprisingly, so I'll answer that real quick before I end the session with one more question for Dr. Goff. This one says, Cassie, will a copy of this excellent session be posted? The answer to that is absolutely. It will be available on the MRF's Facebook page as well as our YouTube page. So I will close this out with one more question for Dr. Goff. Would there be a particular patient case or situation where a clinical trial may not be suitable treatment pathway?
Again, a highly individualized question. For a lot of people who are diagnosed with cancer, it is sort of the first unusual medical event that's ever happened to them. They've maybe had a little bit of hypertension, a little hypercholesterolemia, a little bit of diabetes, but they've never had a serious, unusual sort of event happen to them. And when cancer strikes them, it becomes their most pressing medical situation. Those patients are great for clinical trials. Patients that have a more complex medical history make things a little bit more difficult. And a lot of that has to do with some of the underlying science that may not be so easy to explain to people that aren't intimately involved in the science. For instance, if you're looking at a drug that specifically needs to work on healthy CD4 T cells, and the patient has a condition where they don't have that many CD4 T cells, then that's not the right patient to test that question in. Or if someone has a history of or an active autoimmune disease where there are T cells within their body that are actively attacking normal tissues, you know, some of the checkpoint inhibitors can actually flare that up and make that worse. Now, there is actually a clinical trial testing that very question in that specific patient population, because those patients were excluded from the bigger trials that led to the approval of those drugs, because the mechanism is such that you wouldn't think you would want to let those T cells go, to let those T cells do what they need to do. And so I would say patients with very complex medical histories, unusual medical things that have happened to them in the past, sometimes that diagnosis of cancer never becomes the most pressing diagnosis for that patient. There are other problems, end-stage CHF, liver failure, chronic kidney disease. And if you pursue aggressive clinical trials, one, the investigational agent may make that other problem worse. And two, the whole point with clinical trials is to weigh the risk benefit. And if you are someone who is already suffering from a number of other medical conditions, that risk benefit is going to weigh heavier on the risk almost every time. And so when there is not much proven benefit yet, it's really hard to balance that out. And I think it's unfortunate, and we hate having to tell people that they're not the right fit for a trial, but it's usually based on things that aren't really, you can't objectively put a number on it. It's not a particular lab value. It's not a particular echocardiogram finding. It's just the whole picture changes what we see as the risk benefit profile. And that makes it a little difficult.
I just want to piggyback off of that, Dr. Goff, and say that while joining or participating in a particular clinical trial or in clinical trials at all might not be the right decision, researching, understanding, and learning about clinical trials is always the right decision.
That is absolutely correct, Jamie. Well, this was awesome. This concludes our first wow, it's late in the afternoon, isn't it? Our first Ask the Expert series presented by OncoSec. The MRF is so thrilled to have OncoSec as such a dedicated partner to increasing melanoma patient advocacy and awareness. We would absolutely like to express our gratitude to both Dr. Stephanie Goff for sharing her expertise around clinical trials, and a super special thank you to melanoma survivor and super advocate Jamie Goldfarb for sharing your story of bravery and perspective of melanoma clinical trials. My goodness. And I just want to remind everybody that the next Ask the Expert presented by OncoSec session will be Wednesday, September 23rd at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, 1 p.m. Pacific Time. This session will cover melanoma survivorship and the important role of care partners with UCSD's Dr. Gregory Daniels and Joy and Jim Knox. Thank you so much.